Okay, welcome to CIIS, and welcome to Spiritual Emergence and Other Extraordinary Experiences presentation of Nick Walker speaking on neurodiversity, the path of liberation. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Nick Walker, although I'm sure you know already a lot about the good work that he's doing. But first I want to share a little bit about the Spiritual Emergence group here. We're really grateful that we have the opportunity to share an alternate perspective on what might be considered challenging psychological circumstances. And that may show up and be pathologized in a lot of different ways in the common institution, but many of us, and through the years, studies work with Stan Groff and at Esalen and things like that, we know that there's something called spiritual emergence, which if it's held in a good way, can be fruitful. If not, it can also be challenging. So we're trying to get the word out and have a broader perspective on what that means. So thank you for being here. I do have a sign-up sheet. I'm going to pass that around. If you'd like to know more about that. And also on Thursday, March 12th, we're going to have our next presentation, which is Phenomenology of the Spiritual Emergence Ordeal, from 7 to 9:30 with Dr. Howie Whitehouse. So yeah, come and check that out as well. Okay. So Nick Walker, thank you so much for being here, Nick. Nick Walker is an autistic educator, author, speaker, and transdisciplinary scholar and martial artist. He's a faculty member at the Interdisciplinary Studies BA program at California Institute of Integral Studies and the Psychology and Liberal Arts BA program at Sofia University. He holds a 6th degree black belt in Aikido and is founder and senior instructor of the Aikido Shusekai dojo in Berkeley, California. And there are some flyers in the back if you're interested in that aspect of his work. He's a leading voice in the emergent field of neurodiversity and has been a key figure in the evolution of the autistic community and culture since 2003. Let's give a warm welcome to Nick Walker. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Is the mic picking me up well here? I can never tell how far away from my face to hold these things, so this might cut in and out and all that. But thank you for the introduction, Michelle, and thanks to the Spiritual Emergence group for having me here. Thank you all for coming. I love the term spiritual emergence, and then I always wonder, emergence of what is the question. What exactly is emerging? And there's a quality that I've got on my mind lately, elusive quality called authenticity. And I think that's part of what's emerging. I'm interested in authenticity, in the authentic self, in authentic contact between authentic selves. And this is one reason that I do not use notes when I speak, and I don't think in advance about what I'm going to say. And in fact, when I write a description of what the talk is going to be about, I'm actually lying because I don't know what I'm going to say. I really, I don't do slideshows either, none of that. I don't want you watching television here, right? It's all about us here. So I will ramble, I will get confused, I never give the same talk twice, and I'll talk for a while, and then we'll do Q&A so I can make sure I'm responding to what you're genuinely interested in. And now what I made up in my head, you're probably interested in. So let's do some authenticity here. I got my master's degree in somatic psychology here, and while I was doing that, I came upon the work of a psychoanalyst named D.W. Winnicott, who's a pioneer in the field of child psychology. And Winnicott, the center core piece of Winnicott's work really grabbed me, and he talked about the true self and the false self. He said, everyone is born with certain intrinsic potentials, and these days, as we have a more of a leaning in psychology toward the neurosciences, and I'm supposed to know about that stuff because I'm talking about neurodiversity. So we would say maybe that these are genetically determined neurologically potentials and neurological tendencies and traits, and we're born and they're ours to develop. These potentials are ours to develop creatively, to live our life as a work of art, and of course babies start doing that immediately. Immediately they start just doing stuff that's really creative. They're all curiosity-based. Whoa, what happens if I do this? I don't know what anything is. What happens? What happens if I do this? Babies are great. They just explore and experiment and reach for things, and there's no social restrictions that they've internalized yet about, oh, I can't do this, I can't touch this, If I'm curious about someone, I can smell them, I can taste them. I'm really sad that it's not socially acceptable for me to smell and taste everyone I meet. You all look delicious. So, babies are born with that, and they're born with what Winnicott called, there's a true self, which is the potential self, the potential creative self that develops as the baby explores the world and interacts with the culture and grows and develops itself by moving around and exploring stuff and trying things out. But this true self gets interfered with to some degree by the cultural, social restrictions we run into, by just what it's acceptable to do, what it's not acceptable to do, what it's safe to do, what it's not safe to do, and that's okay. That's part of the context. If you're creating a work of art in any medium, there are restrictions imposed by the nature of the medium. I can do all kinds of things with a pen and paper, but I can't make a drawing that bursts into flames if you look at it a certain way. I can maybe draw realistic flames, but there are certain restrictions in the medium where it would be really cool if somebody, turned to the next page of my book and suddenly fire shot out of it, but it's really hard to arrange in a two-dimensional medium. So we just accept, as part of being an artist, is working within a medium with its restrictions, and a creative life is like that too. There are restrictions to my life. There are things my brain will do and won't do. I can develop a certain degree of muscle or flexibility or hardness or softness in my body as I like, but I can't sprout wings, or I haven't figured out how to yet. There are restrictions built in, and the cultural context is part of that. Oh, in this culture, these things are possible for me, and these things aren't. And then, of course, part of living a creative life is that we, the individual and the culture, end up influencing each other. We accept certain limitations of the culture. Oh, I'm not allowed to go around tasting everyone I meet. But then as we grow, we start altering the culture. We have the potential to interact with the culture and start playing with it, to interface. And suddenly there's a mutual influence going on, a dance of culture. And this is human creativity. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. We're all playing with culture. We're all in this culture together, and we make it by participating in it. And that means we affect its course. Maybe I have the misfortune to be born into a culture where we can't go up and sniff and taste each other, except that I keep talking about it when I speak in public, and so I'm planting that idea, and if enough people think that's really cool, they'll start doing it, at least with each other, and it will spread, and the culture will change. So, there's that. But for most people, unfortunately, there's also excessive restriction imposed on children, unnecessary restriction. Parents have their own their own uptightness and their own things they don't want you to do, and teachers at school have their own uptightness. It's that wonderful poem by the poet Philip Larkin called "This Be the Verse." It begins, "They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They might not mean to, but they do." So, we get fucked up because we want to express certain parts of ourselves, but it's not safe. And maybe you grow up in a household where it's never okay to be loud, or it's never okay to move in certain ways, to dance in certain ways. You start dancing in the supermarket when you're 2, and mom says, "Stop that, you're embarrassing me." And so people have to learn. People end up having to learn to restrict themselves and compress themselves in certain ways. "Oh, I'm not allowed to do that. I can't do that. It's not safe for me. I will get shamed," or I notice that my parents withdraw some of their expression of love from me, or I get horribly punished maybe. There's all kinds of signals little kids and older kids pick up from the environment about what's not okay to do or what's not safe to do. And sometimes that's a very subtle emotional safety, and sometimes it's really about direct physical safety, depending on how bad your childhood environment is. But people end up building what Winnicott called the false self, which is the compliant self, the self that complies with the demands of the big, scary grown-ups around you. And the false self is made up of what everybody else wants you to be, and it's that mask where you have to hide all of that unacceptable stuff, all of the stuff that's not acceptable about your true self and your true potential, all of the stuff you don't get to express. And different psychologists and other clever people have talked about this in different ways over time. I mean, Jung talked about this in terms of the shadow, that parts of us aren't accepted and aren't allowed, and we put them into the shadow. And Freud talked about repression, but really just focused kind of on the sexual aspects of it. But it's the whole being. All sorts of expressions get suppressed behind the mask of the false self. And so when I think about spiritual emergence or liberation of the self, what I'm thinking about is liberation of the true self, is how to find this authenticity. What do I really want to be? If I could be anyone I wanted. If I wasn't worried about what mom and dad were going to say, or people saying, "No, stop that, that's embarrassing," or being laughed at. If I wasn't worried about any of that stuff, what could I be? What could I be? And that's what I think of with spiritual emergence. What wants to emerge that maybe I'm holding back? What wants to come out from behind the mask? Now, another psychologist, Wilhelm Reich, interesting fellow and one of the founding figures in the field of somatic psychology, talked about this process in physical terms, what happens in the body, because of course ourselves are embodied, right? Who we are is a body, and depending on your belief system, maybe that body is an expression of a soul, or a spiritual expression. Maybe it is an incarnation of a soul, the vehicle for our spirits. Or maybe it goes the other way around. Maybe we started as bodies and the spiritual is a biological process of, achieving the highest potential of our brains. Lots of different ways you can think about it, and I don't pretend to any particular knowledge of it, but there are these, whatever we are is what we're embodying. It's there in a body, and it's different. What we're actually embodying, for real, is different from all the things that we could be, if only. I see this all the time. I'm an Aikido teacher, and I see all the time, this difference between fantasy and reality. people come in often to Aikido because it has this reputation as following all these spiritual principles, being, get new students come in and they teach me, they come in and they lecture me about how Aikido is an expression of the principles of Taoism or Buddhism or Shinto or Landmark Forum or whatever they're into, how they've always wanted to do Aikido, but that doesn't mean they can do it. And I love Aikido because it constantly challenges one to actually do this. What does it actually mean to put these spiritual principles into practice so they're not abstract? The founder of Aikido, and talking about what he has this little speech he gave sometimes about what Aikido is about. The purpose of Aikido is not to beat others, but to triumph over the mind of discord in yourself first. And then it's all wonderful stuff. And then at the end, he gets you. He says, "This is not mere theory. You practice it." Oh, it's so much easier when it's mere theory. But what are we actually embodying? What are you actually embodying? You may say, "Oh, I believe in peace and love," but when actually confronted with a conflict, what is your body doing? What is your body doing? Is your body saying, "Oh, yes, let's try to work this out," or are you going, "Kill, kill"? Okay, so what are you really embodying? And that is part of what I think of around emergence and authenticity too. How do we actually embody this true self? How are we embodying a false self? And how do we change it? So this was, I warned you I would ramble, and we started to talk about Wilhelm Reich, and Wilhelm Reich talked about how this is embodied, that there's a potential embodiment that has a lot of flow and joy to it, a lot of just this free flow of joy and pleasure and connection. And then we learn the hard way to hold certain things back. This is what Winnicott called the construction of the false self. And this has to happen some way. How do we hold ourselves back from sniffing and tasting people and touching everything and moving around in ways that are not socially acceptable or not safe in our childhood? How do we stop doing this stuff? How do we stop feeling stuff that we're not allowed to feel or that it's not safe to feel? And of course the answer is these chronic unconscious muscle tensions where we hold ourselves back, numb ourselves. And Reich called this character armor. And so then there's this question is, now we take it to a physical level, or the emergence. We have the question of emergence, and how do you let a true or authentic self emerge, an authentic connection emerge? And then the answer is you have to break down the false self, and that consists of breaking down character armor, of actually liberating movement. It's a physical liberation of the body from chronic restrictions that maybe were originally self-imposed in response to the demands of your environment, but are now just carried around unconsciously. So, neurodiversity. Let's talk about that, because the flyer says I'm going to. Neurodiversity is the diversity of human brains and human minds. So this idea of neurodiversity, the human species is neurodiverse, neurologically diverse, neurocognitively diverse, in the same way that we have a diversity of possible gender expressions and ethnicities and cultures and all that all those many different ways in which people can be diverse and different from one another, which makes life exciting and creative and beautiful. And so neurodiversity, the diversity of brains, the diversity of minds, and the term was coined originally by autistic people. And there's the neurodiversity, the biological fact. We are a neurodiverse species. And then there's the neurodiversity paradigm, which developed in the autistic community and has been spreading and rippling outward from there. By the way, I want to say, we have Steve Silberman in the audience today. Steve just completed writing a book called Neurotribes, which is a history of how the neurodiversity movement got started and what led up to that. And you will find flyers for that book on the back table with the refreshments after the talk, next to flyers from my Aikido dojo. I recommend both the Aikido dojo and the book. The book will be out in August. The dojo's already there waiting for you. So, this has been a paid commercial announcement. Now back to our talk. Pay up, pay up. So the autistic community starts this idea, there's an autistic civil rights movement that emerges initially in the 80s and picks up speed through the 1990s and is continuing to pick up speed and momentum. And so they developed this term neurodiversity and this paradigm neurodiversity, which says neurodiversity is a form of human diversity that works the same way as other forms of human diversity, meaning a couple of things. One, diversity is creative potential. You don't get very far creatively if everyone thinks the same and acts the same. Right? So much cultural beauty comes from cultural diversity. You know, you don't get things like jazz, for instance, existing, or rock and roll existing in cultures where everyone's the same. It's all this beauty and art and transformation happens when cultures come together. I mean, here we are at an event by an organization on spiritual emergence. And how many different cultures had to come together to hatch this idea of spiritual emergence? You needed this combination of like Western psychology and all of these people doing psychedelics, and then you need all these people getting influenced by Eastern religions, by Buddhism, and there's all of these different cultural influences about spirituality and psychology and what it means for humans to develop their potential, and all of those ideas have to come together to hatch this concept of spiritual emergence. So diversity is fertile, creative ground, and that includes neurodiversity, that includes the diversity of different minds and brains, and exciting things are introduced into the culture by people whose minds work differently from those of most of the people around them. So, it's kind of an automatic outside the box thing. Oh, my brain's not wired to even see the box, so I kind of got to think outside it. And hey guys, have you seen what the outside of your box looks like? Dude. So there's the creative potential of neurodiversity, but because it emerged from a civil rights movement, the the initial focus of the neurodiversity movement has been the fact that it's neurodiversity is subject to the same social power dynamics as other forms of diversity. So there's been this deconstruction of our dialogues around autism and other forms of neurodivergence, divergence from neurocognitive social norms. There's been this deconstruction of the discourse around these things, of why are certain sorts of brains pathologized? Why are they considered disordered or ill? What is that? What's up with that? This is just another social power dynamic, and it starts, when you start to look at it that way, oh, this is a diversity issue. This is a minority being looked down on and controlled by a majority, and we've all seen that before around gender and sexual orientation and ethnicity and culture, and the dynamics essentially work the same way. And you can get these fancy, books like the DSM and did I hear a boo when I said the DSM? Yeah, these fancy books like the DSM and all these studies and stuff talking about how autism is a disorder. But remember how long science has been used in the past to justify racism and colonialism and sexism and homophobia. And it's just the same pattern. And fortunately, autistic people are really good at pattern recognition. So that's the neurodiversity paradigm, and then there's a neurodiversity movement, which is started out as the autistic rights movement and has started to expand beyond just being, as the name implies, it's expanded beyond just autism and started making inroads into other forms of neurodivergence. It's not so the autistic community has been trailblazers in most of the literature on neurodiversity, and the neurodiversity paradigm is still being produced within the autistic community, or by autistic scholars, or by people like Steve who have been studying and talking to the autistic community, and we love it when people listen. So, but again, looking to spread it, looking to expand outward, because of course I want to see a world where autistic people are allowed to be themselves and be accepted and not be pathologized, but I want to see that for every form of neurodivergence, and we'll be talking more about that soon, and by we I mean me, but we'll do Q&A too. So I'm going to tie this in now with where I started, which was character armor and the true self and the false self, the emergence of authenticity, because a consequence of what I call the pathology paradigm, the pathologizing of autism and other forms of neurodivergence, a consequence is that there is a focus. Well, first of all, there's a consequence in that the first consequence is just by pathologizing something, by saying it's a disorder or an illness, you make it the province of the medical and psychiatric establishments and something to be treated, something to be approached as an illness, as a disorder, as a problem, and treated. So that, start there, that's a problem to start with. Right away, you start giving people the message that their natural way their brain works and their bodies want to move, what Winnicott would call the true self, is wrong, is a disease. And then you get, well, how are people treated under this paradigm, under the pathology paradigm? And what happens? What happens is there's all these treatments developed, and not just treatments, but parenting styles, just societal approaches. How do we deal with pathologized neurodivergent groups like autistic people? And the answer is we try to normalize them. We try to make them normal, that is make them conform to societal norms, make them act. Neurotypical is the word that developed in the autistic community. Neurotypical meaning not neurodivergent. Neurotypical means straight. Is the neurological equivalent of straight or white. If you're neurotypical, your brain is white. So how do we make them act neurotypical? The number one treatment right now that is prescribed for autistic children, and again we ask, treatment for what? Yeah, there's an assumption right away. They're working off the assumption that it's a problem, it's a disease, it needs treatment. The number one treatment is something called ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, which has the explicitly stated goal of, as they put it, making the autistic child indistinguishable from a non-autistic child, indistinguishable from a typical child, is the phrase they use. So, how do you do that? I mean, that basically, take this person and make them indistinguishable from these other people who aren't actually like them. I mean, basically the advertising materials for ABA are saying, we will construct a false self for your child. And it's pretty much what they do. Now, historical note, ABA was originally developed in a pair of dual projects together. Someone working down in Southern California in the UC system, a doctor named Lovas, developed ABA, and he had two projects going. One of them he was trying to get autistic children to not display any outward traits of autism. And the other project was called the Feminine Boy Project, and the goal was to keep boys from becoming gay by keeping them from exhibiting feminine behaviors, keeping them from demonstrating gender non-conforming behaviors. No, keep preventing them from doing this, involved, hitting them and electrocuting them and stuff when they did these things. And then eventually it became unfashionable to try to cure homosexuality. It's still fashionable in some circles, but that's shrinking. There's still behaviorist-based, cures for being gay out there, in the right wing, but they're going away. They're going away. There's more and more, there's legislation against them. They're certainly unfashionable in these parts. And here at CIIS, still going strong for autism, though. And somehow that's different. Oh, that's right, because autistic people have a disorder. Of course, according to the DSM, so did gay people until sometime in the 1970s. But anyway, even without ABA, the general way of dealing with autistic people is, in society, among, certainly with autistic kids, among parents, doctors, educators, autism is a problem. You got to stop them from being autistic, and what that means usually is, you get them to stop acting like they're autistic. You get them to stop showing the outward traits of autism. Get them to stop moving like autistic people. Get them to stop saying the kind of things that only autistic people would say. Get them to be outwardly indistinguishable. In other words, to create a neurotypical false self. It's all about stuffing them into the closet. So, emergence. How do we emerge? How do we emerge from the closet? And I think this is an important question here. I think that it's, this is the crux. I think that what happens with autistic people in terms of being forced into a closet, developing this false self and this armor that restricts how they move and gets them to sort of hide the fact that they're autistic, gets them to try to pass. I think that this is a magnification of what happens to everyone. So I went through my own exciting process of spiritual emergence, still in progress, discovering myself as an autistic person and breaking down the character armor and learning to move like an autistic person again and be an autistic person all the way. And it was a fabulously liberating experience, and it taught me a huge amount about how these liberating experiences work and how they work for everyone. It's like, yeah, wow, okay. I got to liberate my autistic self, and in a way, it was extra hard because I knew that what I was busting out with and showing the world was heavily pathologized and stigmatized. And I knew that what I was busting out with was really, really weird, and that if I let it out enough, I would never pass for normal again, and that might be inconvenient. And so, that was challenging, but at the same time, I had this great advantage because there's something distinctive about it. I could look at other autistic people. I could look at pictures I could look at films of autistic children, where you'd find these films, from studies on autistic children where they say, and this is this child is hopelessly unreachable. Look at, we're just rocking back and forth, and, hopelessly lost to autism. And I said, oh, that's not what I see. I see someone who's free. That's what I want to be. Oh, I remember. I can look at these and say, oh, wow, that's how I moved when I was 2. I've forgotten. How does that feel? And start to get it back. So in a way, the fact that there was a very specific set of traits to reclaim in a community of people out there who had these traits and had hidden them or not hidden them to various degrees provided me with some guideposts. In a way, it's more challenging to be relatively close to neurotypical and have to liberate your true self, because it's much harder to differentiate between what's cultural programming and what's your true self. What's the potential of your true self? How did you move when you were a baby? How did you move when you were 2? How did you move when you were a child and nobody was watching? Or when it was just you and other kids? What did you learn not to do, and where did you learn it? And can you find your way back to it? And what are the benefits of finding your way back to it? It was really clear for me because, I hear autistic people talk about brain fog, about not being able to think clearly, and not being able to function, and feeling anxiety all the time, and these things get associated with autism. People, because autism is pathologized, all autistic suffering gets considered to be symptoms of autism. I don't believe autism has symptoms because that's disease language. I think autism just has some characteristic traits. I would never talk about the symptoms of someone's ethnicity. So, although I myself am a symptom of heterosexuality, but and so are many people in this room probably, but I don't want to pathologize heterosexuality, but it has consequences. So, so there's this anxiety and depression and brain fog and all these difficulties that so many autistic people report and are considered to be symptoms of autism. And I see that's bullshit. I personally have discovered in my own experience that that is bullshit, that these are not symptoms of autism. These are symptoms of partially or fully suppressing the outward signs of one's autism. I did not expect this. This is not what I expected when I set out on the journey to start breaking down the character armor that was holding me back and liberating my autistic way of moving. I did not expect that I would stop having brain fog. I did not expect that I would go from being virtually unable to write to being a straight A college student. That was a total shock. I was not capable of doing schoolwork back when I was in elementary school and high school and all that. It was a total shock to me to go to college after 15 years away from school, to go to college. I went to college in my 30s after figuring out I was autistic and starting to move. And wow, the more I let myself be autistic, the more clearly I can think. I'm smart. I mean, people told me that when I was a kid, because I was good with words, but it was always, you're smart, so why aren't you working to capacity? You're smart, so you must be misbehaving deliberately. It was never, you're smart so you can do well in school. It was, you're smart, so it's a shame that you'll probably be in institutions your whole life. But I found all these things I could do. When I let myself move, it was like, oh, there's all these ways my brain works that are right. This is my true self. There's all these things my brain can do. Weird, cool shit my brain can do if I let myself move like an autistic person, if I let myself be autistic, if I let myself think like an autistic person, but that means moving like an autistic person. You cannot hold that right. It's like you got to embody it. Thinking is an embodied practice. You ever sit and meditate and try to clear your mind? Try this as homework, right? I teach in the school, so I'm allowed to assign homework, right? Try this. Try to sit and meditate and clear your mind and be calm and serene while you tense all of your muscles and quiver violently. Doesn't work. Relax the body, relax the breathing, still all the throat and the little subvocalization, still the eyes, and then the mind starts to get calm. It's embodied. So all this cool stuff my brain could do, well, I had to let my body do what it wanted to do in order to access that. There's the distinctively autistic movements that just sort of explore the sensory environment and take pleasure in the sensory environment and all that. Is the word for that in the autistic community is stimming. Stimming, that's everything from rocking back and forth to looking at pretty shiny things and sniffing things and really anything, all the cool stuff we can do with our bodies. You don't have to be autistic to stim, right? If you ever just did anything with your body for the sheer pleasure of it, that's stimming. So, I I keep hearing from people who are sort of getting at accepting and depathologizing autism people. I hear this thing sometimes, using AVA and stuff to stop autistic children from stimming is wrong. I agree. Because stimming is a necessary thing for self-calming. I halfway agree. Yes. Yes, it is. But that always bugs me when I hear that, because it makes it sound like that's all it's about. No, different kinds of stimming are keys to access all of the cool stuff our mind can do. And that is not just for autistic people. So, on our topic of spiritual emergence and self-liberation, number one piece of advice I can give you for self-liberation is move. Find how your body really likes to move. Touch things, touch, play, smell, taste, enjoy, indulge in the sensory pleasures of movement and touch. Let yourself rock back and forth and wander and do whatever the heck your body wants to do for no reason except that you feel an impulse to do it. And it takes a long time. It's a big journey of liberation just to learn to notice those impulses. But find those impulses and follow them, and amazing things will happen in your brain. It's all connected. You will build new neural pathways, and stuff will wake up that you didn't know you had in there. But that's your true self waking up. That's your true self being like, oh, now it's time to play. I've been waiting. About time. So I thought I'd talk a little bit before we go into Q&A and stuff about extending the neurodiversity paradigm to other forms of neurodivergence besides autism, and I guess I already just talked about extending it to everyone. Everyone. Because there's neurodivergent, which is diverging from neurotypical, diverging from the socially accepted majority norms. But neurodiversity encompasses all of humanity. We're a neurodiverse species, right? Some people in this room may be neurotypical. Some people may be neurodivergent in all kinds of interesting ways, but we're all part of the spectrum of human neurodiversity. We're a neurodiverse room. So, I think all of this stuff applies to everyone's awakening. Everyone gets to find out. I don't think you should have to be autistic or bipolar or dyslexic to get to do weird stuff with your brain and liberate your stuff by moving in exciting, fun ways. I think that's something everyone ought to do, because everyone has a startling, beautiful, creative, true self in there. Everyone. You don't have to be a member of a pathologized neurological minority in order to be awesome. So, I dislike, this is where I was going eventually, I knew I had to get here eventually, I dislike the term mental illness for that reason. Autistic people are not called mentally ill. Autism is called a disorder, and we call it, developmentally disabled, or developmental disorder. And there are definitely people and organizations that talk about it as a disease or an illness, but generally, when people say mentally ill, are talking about bipolar, schizophrenia, or that sort of thing. That's sort of a different category that autism is recognized as this neurodevelopmental thing now, generally speaking, and it's something different from, that wasn't always the case, by the way, if you want to find out how that distinction developed, read Steve's book. But this is, in a way, I mean, autistic people were lucky, we're trailblazers in the neurodiversity movement, this concept of neurodiversity, because we have this special category of where this is like, it's a neurodevelopmental thing that's being called a disorder, but at least it's acknowledged that it is neurodevelopmental, it is genetically inherent in our brains, and it's and there, you know, there's a lot of us, and we're good at pattern recognition, as I said. So, we're well set up to sort of be trailblazers in this paradigm. But I'm very interested in watching it spread to other neurotypes. I think starting with things that have been traditionally been called learning disorders in the DSM, or learning disabilities, more widely, more commonly, things like dyslexia, for instance. Dyslexics are great candidates for the neurodiversity paradigm. Dyslexia is cool. I like dyslexic people. I mean, I spend a lot of time as a somatic psychologist and as an Aikido teacher watching people move. I can usually tell if someone's autistic after I watch them move for a while. I can also usually tell if someone's dyslexic now by watching them move. Dyslexia is such a funny word. A lot of this stuff needs to be renamed, I mean, with autism, we sort of just taken the name autism and run with it and said, okay, yes, we're autistic. And the big thing as far as differentiating ourselves, separating ourselves from the pathology paradigm has been, instead of saying we have autism, which is disease language, to say we are autistic. It is who we are in the same way as our ethnicity or our gender identity or whatever, rather than this illness or the separate thing we have. It is our true self. I am autistic. It's part of who we really are. So that was a fairly easy reclaiming of a word. And it's harder to reclaim something like ADHD because disorder is built into the word, and deficit, right? That educators hate having ADHD kids in our classroom because they put deficit and disorder both in the name, So that they might have to change that name sooner or later. I think it should be renamed to kinetic learning style. But dyslexia also, it's named, it's like this name for like the one thing that they have trouble with. So that's, but I found it turns out dyslexics have this huge the thing where they don't do that two-dimensional reading, writing two-dimensional stuff on the page very well. That's because their brain is wired for 3D spatial awareness in a big way. They have this amazing spatial awareness, and when dyslexic people are not restricted in how they move, when they haven't internalized a lot of character armor, or when they bust out of it, they have the coolest ways of moving. It's like watching spider monkeys. It's awesome. I love how dyslexic people move when they let themselves move the way their bodies want to, all that spatial awareness. And again, the brain starts to be able to do cool things when you start moving. How you move affects your brain. We're building new neural pathways all the time. So if you start moving in a particular way, if you spend all your time holding yourself back from moving in particular ways, you're holding back your brain's development. You're just building these grooves. Yes, I will stay tense here. I will not move. I will not move. And you're building a groove deeper into your brain. And as soon as you start busting out of it, whoa, suddenly you start building new neural pathways, and they make all sorts of new connections. Very, very fun. So let's talk about, the harder ones to reclaim, are like bipolar, schizophrenia and all. They're so pathologized and so feared. And this term mental illness is a great scam by the pharmaceutical industry. This idea that these are illnesses and they need medicine. What better way to sell people medicine than convince them that they're ill? But now I want to say, I'm not dogmatically anti-medication. I am anti-bullshit. Right? And I think that the term mental illness is bullshit. I think that it's bullshit to say that these are, there are government labs here, if we want to go all paranoid for a moment. There are government labs where they have little vials of anthrax and smallpox and measles and weird hybrid shit that they really don't want you to know about. Smallpox, all that stuff. You cannot have a vial of bipolar. You can't have a vial of autism. It does not exist outside of the people who embody it. So, it's us. It's not illness. But I'm in favor of people being allowed to do anything with their brains that they want to. So, because of that, I'm not anti-medication. If you don't like how your brain operates in the morning, you're allowed to drink coffee. And I think that's a good thing. I don't drink coffee, but I support your right to drink coffee. And if you like yourself better when you are high, I support your right to smoke pot without needing to prove that it is medically necessary. It shouldn't have to be medically necessary. It should just be, you should be able to go and say, I need to buy a whole lot of legal pot because it makes me more awesome. Trust me, I am happier. You will like me better when I'm high. It's not medically necessary, but it is necessary for me in order to contribute maximum beauty to my community. So please let me get high. I think I'm in favor of that. And so, if you don't like how your brain works, and a drug exists that will change it, I think you have a right to take it. So when I say that mental illness is bullshit, I'm not saying nobody should ever take psychotropic medication to alter their brain chemistry. If you are severely depressed and there is a drug that works for you and you want to take it, go ahead. And you should not have to call yourself ill to be able to do that. You should not have to get a permission slip from a psychiatrist to be able to do that. You should be able to do it. You should be able to take Prozac recreationally if you want to. I would not do that, but I think you should be allowed to. So, I'm just in favor of taking this stuff out of the hands of the psychiatric establishment and not having it stigmatized and allowing people the liberty. I don't think people should be involuntarily medicated ever, but I'm all for consensual medication of anyone who wants it. So, illness. It is difficult to convince people. I've found, my wife is bipolar, and she does not identify as having bipolar disorder. She is very into the neurodiversity paradigm. She identifies as bipolar the way I identify as autistic. Figures she was born that way. That's her natural genetic neurological potential there, her true self. she's the happiest bipolar person I know. She's really doing well. You know, she's a fellow Aikido teacher, and she does fabulously well. She takes no meds, and what she does is she just harmonizes with her bipolar brain the way I harmonize with my autistic brain. She lets herself embody it. And a lot of times, you know, like I said, the misery and anxiety of autism is often is not about being autistic. It's about being autistic and trying to resist it, or being autistic and being in an environment that's hostile to autistic people. So my wife is discovering it's the same thing with bipolar, that works the same way. That a lot of the misery of being bipolar comes from trying to force oneself to stay on neurotypical clock time. Oh, now it's time to go to sleep, and now it's time to go to work and sit at the desk, and now I get to exercise. But she's got a brain and a body that's like, no, you're going to spend the next 2 days lying down, and now you're going to spend the next 2 days doing everything really fast. So what she has done is simply constructed a life for herself where she gets to do that. And that works. The misery comes from fighting it. The misery comes from not honoring the natural rhythms of the body and the brain. It's extraordinary how embodied it is too, by the way. I never hear this. I hear about bipolar people, you know, when I read, you know, scientific accounts of them and medical accounts. They just talk about what's going on in the brain in this abstract, and what their moods are, what they're feeling. But living with it, I gotta tell you, it's a whole body thing. Her body temperature changes. You know, the whole metabolism shifts. It's really cool if you are harmonizing with it, if you can build yourself a life where you can work in harmony with it. And of course, you know, that's the key. I think that one reason we have a lot more people noticing autism and seeing it as a problem, a lot more people noticing bipolar and seeing it as a problem. I mean, part of that is that there's a whole industry around selling these things as diseases and selling treatments for them. But also, we live in a society that's increasingly hostile to carving out individual niches. And increasingly, everybody works on clock time and works, no downtime, produce for the machine. And that's not working well for anyone, I think. Neurotypical people don't like that either, usually. So I don't know why everybody stands for it. But if you can carve out a niche where you can work in harmony with what your brain and body want to do, and I tell you, you know, whether you're neurotypical or bipolar or autistic or whatever, that will make a giant difference if you can set yourself up in a position where you can follow your rhythms. And there's this process of acceptance. You know, here again we get to the spiritual emergence idea. You know, it's spiritual emergence in the sense of this follows Buddhist principles of non-attachment. You can't be attached to, I'm going to work this many hours this day, and then this many hours this day, and then this is my weekend. You know, if you're bipolar, your brain is going to tell you when your weekend is and when it isn't, and you got to listen. But if you do listen, suddenly being bipolar doesn't suck. It stops feeling like an illness, according to my wife, you know, and starts feeling like, oh, this is another rhythm to be honored. You're just surfing your neurology. You got to follow the waves, ride the waves. So so we have this question then, you know, how can we create spaces in our lives where we can do this? How do we create spaces? There's a lot of emphasis on, well, how do we adapt? And maybe some people need medications or need certain strategies or need to hide the obvious signs, need to hide their mania, or need to hide that they're hearing voices, or need to hide their way of moving. People need to hide all of this stuff in order to adapt to, I mean, that's why people form false selves originally. They're pressured to hide this stuff, to build the false self, you know? And maybe people have to maintain that in order to keep their jobs. If you have to maintain it in order to keep your relationship, you're in the wrong relationship. But maybe in order to keep your job, maybe in order to keep out of prison in some places, you know? I mean, it depends. Depending on what kind of expression you need to do, and what I mean, there's people get involuntarily institutionalized for expressing themselves in certain ways. So that's got to be you got to find the safe spaces to do that. How do you shape your life? But if we start doing it, if nobody does it, then it stays unsafe for everybody to do. The more weird people are out there doing this weird stuff with their brains and being themselves, the more acceptable it becomes. So those of us who can get away with it, we have an obligation to get away with it. We have an obligation to be really weird, to make space for other people to be really weird. There's one more idea I want to toss out there. There's a lovely phrase that me and some other autistic neurodiversity scholars are playing with right now, which is neuroqueer. And the idea is neuroqueer is to your neurology as being genderqueer is to your gender. And being genderqueer involves a couple of things. If you look at it, there's two main things about genderqueerness. And one of them is letting the true self emerge. One of them is, oh yeah, I'm queer. Wow, I am not, queer, the term queer originally meant like perpendicular, like off at an angle. So like, I am not doing the gender binary thing, and binary gender roles, over here, you're a man, you do the man thing, and you have sex with women, and over here, you're a woman, you do the woman thing, you have sex with men, and so right away, just, if you start having, different sexual orientation from, the gender binaries, man, and you're having sex with men, well, right away, that's the biggest queering of gender roles you can do, but then there's all sorts of other ways to queer your gender and change your gender expression, and so, express your true self, this is being queer, but then there's also queering as a verb, is the other aspect, that you start deliberately messing with your gender expression and playing with it, and it starts to change who you are. Wow, okay, it's not just about who I want to have sex with or, what I want to identify as, but how do I move this? You start, you stop moving like your culture's stereotypes of masculinity or femininity, and you start building new neural pathways, and you start changing the culture. You go out, dressed up in clothes that are considered to belong to people of a different gender from you, or you start, start mixing and matching and playing around with your gender, and you are changing your identity, you are changing your own brain, and you are starting to change your culture, which may push back really hard against you for doing it. So again, the more people who do it, the more safe space there is to do it. Neuroqueering works the same way. There's being neuroqueer, as in accepting your identity as, oh yeah, I am an autistic person and I'm going to move like an autistic person. I'm a bipolar person. I'm going to follow my bipolar rhythms. I am neuroqueer. There's also queering your neurology actively, choosing, I'm going to play with this new way of moving. I'm going to take these interesting drugs. I'm going to make my brain even weirder. I'm going to see what this baby can do. So that's neuroqueering. And then, of course, these things intersect. Because you change your gender performance, you start building new neural pathways. And inevitably, you start moving like an autistic person, You're not moving like your culture's traditional representation of masculinity either. You know, men are not supposed to move their hands around this much unless they're making a fist with them. So this is, this becomes, they start interacting, you know, performance of gender, performance of neurology, all of this stuff starts interacting, and we start queering our performances of our identities in weirder and weirder ways. And again, creating more and more safety for other people to do that, the more all of us do it. I'm gonna stop talking there and start taking questions. And then when you ask me questions, I'll talk a whole lot more, because that's what I do. You've seen how much I can ramble. And I will ramble in response to your questions, or sometimes I won't. So let's start right here.
Hi, I have a lot of questions, but I'll just start with one.
Okay.
You talked a lot about autism, and I'm just curious if you can define what it means for you, and also if you ever grapple with like over-identifying with a label, and how important it is to identify as autistic, and like whether that can be limiting for you as well.
Interesting questions. I think that it's always possible for people to over-identify. That's the case with any label. People over-identify with their genders or their ethnicities or their jobs or whatever. It's always possible. It's not something I struggle with, personally. But I think, what does it mean to over-identify? I think it's over-identifying is a relative term. I think people over-identify when the identifying with something is restricting them, is restricting their self-liberation, restricting the emergence of their true self, when it's an obstacle. Identifying as autistic has never been that for me. It's never interfered with my self-liberation. I think that that's more of a problem for people who buy into the pathology paradigm. I think that people who think of autism as a disease or a disorder or a problem are very much in danger of over-identifying, you know, I'm autistic, so I can't do this. I'm autistic, you know, and I see that happen. I see that happen. I see people say, I can't do this because I'm autistic, and that I think it's okay to say, to acknowledge, you know, it would be, I can't drive. It would be bad news for other people if I decided to, no, I can drive, you know. I'm acknowledging what my brain can do right now and what it can't, but I think when people are saying, you know, I can't have a good romantic relationship because I'm autistic or something like that, because they've been taught that by some toxic therapist, I think that's a problem of over-identification. They're over-identifying with somebody else's definition of autism. And so that's where, you know, they want to maybe stop identifying at least with someone's interpretation of it and say, you know, I'm going to try. I'm going to give this a shot. I'm not going to accept that this is a limitation of my neurotype. I think this is why it's valuable for autistic people who are defying cultural stereotypes of autism, as I myself do, to be very outspoken about it, to put ourselves out there, you know. It's not like I'm like a total attention whore. But I do put myself out there publicly and say, hey, I'm autistic, I have a wonderful relationship, I have, you know, a great child, I have a black belt in Aikido, I get out there and talk to people and love them and all that, because these are all things that autistic people are not expected to be able to do. And it's very important to challenge those expectations. Does that answer your question?
It answers it partly. I'm still curious what exactly you mean when you say you're autistic.
Oh, that's an interesting question. What do I mean when I say I'm autistic? I mean a lot of different things. I mean my brain works in a particular way and there are, you know, and again, these are all cultural constructions here. I mean, what does it mean? You know, what do you identify as far as gender? I don't want to make assumptions. Female. So what does it mean when you say you're female? That's a complicated question.
Do you think of autism, is autism in your case, or do you believe it to be like a solid genetic thing that's like proven to exist in your brain by some kind?
Yeah, because there's been enough neuroscientific research now and genetic research to say yes, there are specific things that are happening in the brain starting in the womb that distinguish autistic brains from non-autistic brains. And at the same time, I look at it as a cultural identity because I have this whole community of autistic people and we can compare notes and say we have common lived experiences. So there's an external scientific view that says, oh, that confirms, oh yeah, there's these genetics and there's these particular phenomena happening in the brain. But there is also a shared cultural phenomena of shared experience. And to me, that would make autism valid even if there were no scientific support for it. More questions?
Oh, quick.
Could
Could we switch mics so that I could get
Yes.
the wireless for people's questions and then you could just use this mic?
Does this work too? Oh, it does work too. Cool. Yes.
Question.
So, Sandra.
Yes, so my question, after what you were saying about neuroqueer,
Yes.
I had never really seen it, and I wanted to ask you if you thought that, like, neurology was a performance. You know how there's all these gender theories saying that, like, gender is performative, like Judith Butler, right? And you say that neurology is performative in many ways, and to see if that's correct. And also, I was curious what you thought about neurological shapeshifters, in many ways, like if we would allow ourselves to be really fluid, like could we at least get a hint of what like different neurological experiences are like? Like could you understand a neurotypical brain if you constrained yourself, and stuff like that?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. I love speaking at CIIS. I'd love that question. I don't get asked that stuff in other places. Thank you. So, yeah, this idea of changing the performance of one's neurology is what I mean by neuroqueering. That just as people shift gender performance, change their gender performance intentionally, in accordance with some inner prompting, some inspiration, some sense of this is what I want to be, just something draws them to start shifting their gender performance. The same thing neurologically. Yes, absolutely. We all, neuroqueering is about doing that intentionally because all of our brains are being altered all of the time by our culture, by our actions, by our habits. Always building new neural pathways, losing old neural pathways, cool stuff is happening in there. The brain is always alive and changing. And so neuroqueering is about doing that deliberately. And autism and neurotypicality and dyslexia and bipolarity and all of that, these are baselines. These are starting points. This is a set of natural potentials that you are born with, but you can build on them in all kinds of ways. And this, again, is what I'm talking about as self-liberation, as spiritual emergence, extraordinary experiences, right? That we can make ourselves extraordinary. Our brains, we can make them into works of art and make ourselves into works of art by exploring our creative impulses, reaching out there, just like babies do. Babies start reaching for things and trying things out, and when we do that same thing, we do the same thing when we're teenagers and we start trying psychedelics, and that does the same thing. Psychedelics are queering our brains. Well, I'm going to try this and see what it does to my mind. Well, I want my mind to do this more. I'm going to take some more of this stuff. And so all of these options are available to us. A meditation practice is a form of neuroqueering. It is, I'm going to start actively cultivating something new that will change my brain because I want to embody something new. Changing the performance, and changing the performance changes the brain. Following the brain's impulses changes the brain and changes the performance. So yes, how do you want to perform your neurotype? How big do you want to make it? And if you start making that performance smaller and more subtle, that does something to the brain. And if you start making it more big and loud, that does something to the brain. As to the second part of your question, that is interesting. That is, I don't know to what extent we can experience other neurotypes or what it's like to be in someone else's brain. We have no way of reality testing that, really. No way of knowing. I have no idea. We can try. I certainly have experiences of extreme empathy for people whose neurotypes are very different from mine, whose brains are very different from mine, where I know what's going on with them, but I don't necessarily know what it's like from the inside, what it would be like to be them. But it would be worth trying. It's worth playing with. It is worth experimenting. I think that there is something to be learned from moving like people of other neurotypes. There's something to be learned from that. I learn from that. I mean, autistic people are encouraged to imitate neurotypical people, but in a very wooden sort of way. But what if you just imitate the person you're sitting with, regardless of their neurotype, and start trying to tap into their body language? And what if more people try moving autistically? What if more people... I've had that experience. I've actually had the experience of trying to imitate the movements of my dyslexic friends, and it has increased my spatial awareness. So, yes, you're onto something. Play with it, report back. Next question. Yes, sir.
One of the ways I identify is as an addict. And interestingly, this morning, I got caught up in a Facebook discussion.
That happens to the best of us.
I know. And to the worst of us, too. Somebody had posted an article where something along the lines of, I'm breaking up with the word addict, I'm not using this word anymore, I want to get rid of it, I want to, sort of remove this word from the culture, it's derogatory, all these other things. We have to talk about drug seeking or non-drug seeking or whatever talk about it in terms of behaviors, but getting rid of this word. And my initial reaction was, fuck you. I'm an addict. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about addiction as sort of not falling into necessarily the same kind of genetic neurotype, possibly influenced by choice. Can a person be an addict who never does drugs, never drinks, never engages in addictive behavior?
That's a very interesting question. One thing that is, I've heard a lot of nature versus nurture debates, and one thing that's kind of going on scientifically right now in terms of genetic science is the interesting discovery that nature and nurture are not as easily separated as one might think. That in fact certain experiences will alter how DNA is expressed. So it's really all one big interconnected system, and all of our distinctions between these different things are artificial. And you draw the line somewhere, but it's pretty arbitrary because the whole system is intertwined with itself and deeply complex. So that's a fancy way of saying that I'm not really qualified to tackle the question of where addiction comes from. But I mean, certainly it's. I think that there are people who have predispositions to some degree. I think certain kinds of neurology will predispose people to it. I mean, I know that for a fact in terms of just watching people with different neurotypes try different drugs over the course of my life. My own experience. I've tried to get addicted to things. It doesn't work for me. I'm too addicted to my own brain chemistry, too addicted to autistic ways of thinking. I spent a while, I think a few weeks once doing morphine. I don't even remember why. I just thought I was curious, I think, about it. And I got so bored with it, and I just stopped and had no withdrawal symptoms. Because I was just like, oh my God, there's all this cool shit my brain does all the time, and I can't do it when I'm on this stuff. I just gotta stop, and I stopped. Anyways, so I think there's definite predispositions to addictions to particular things for particular people. Certainly, if you have a bipolar brain chemistry and there's a lot of up and down, there's very easy to want to get addicted to something that regulates that for you. But yeah, and then there's environmental influences, there's family influences. Addiction tends to run in families, and how much of that is genetic, and how much of that is learned family patterns, and how much of those two things really separable. So, as far as identifying though, again, I'm all about liberty. I'm not really dogmatically into what people should do. I don't like the term mentally ill, for instance. But if that works for someone, if it's actually helping them to think of themselves as mentally ill, I can't imagine how that would be helpful to someone personally. But if somebody says, I tried identifying all these different ways, I tried thinking of myself as, bipolar, I tried thinking of this as a spiritual emergence thing, I tried thinking there's nothing wrong with me, I tried thinking of myself as possessed by evil spirits, and in the end I decided that thinking of myself as mentally ill was the healthiest way. I'm not going to stop them. I'm not going to say, no, you didn't have this experience, you're wrong, it's not the healthiest way. So I just want people to question the paradigm of mental illness. So same thing with addiction. I can't say if it's useful for you. I know people who have been able to get themselves clean, and who obviously needed to, people who were destroying themselves, and were able to get themselves clean through 12-step programs by going in every day and saying, hi, my name is Frank, I'm an addict, and owning that label, and it worked for them. It saved their lives. And I know people who have stopped calling themselves addicts and ditched the label entirely and said, I'm not that. I'm just going to change how I live. I'm going to break these patterns, and have been able to then indulge every now and then in something that they weren't addicted to, that they were previously subject to addiction to, and they've been okay with it. But I don't know if that works for everyone. So again, I say what works for you. I say, we got to keep the word in the language because it works for some people, but I also wouldn't impose it on people who it wasn't working for. Yes, Nikki.
There was someone
Oh,
back first. Oh my God.
all right. Who is out there with a question? I see someone there. And then I see Henny out there too, and Nikki. Oh, hello.
Well, this has been great hearing this from an embodied semantic person.
Thank you.
And I can relate to a lot of it because I was semantic before I got into all the school stuff, it was my body wanting to play out.
Oh, yeah.
So, you said a couple interesting things. I want to try and connect them and just see if you give me feedback. But
Sure.
something about the queering and the kind of as a phenomenon like bracketing, almost bracketing the taken for granted that you're doing that methodology. So it's a methodology actually that
Yes.
we can use. So
Yes.
I like that one. But the breaking of patterns was a ritual enactment that was done throughout history. You go to the ritual to break patterns. So we have these little coves of knowledge, there for us. So this is beautiful to see it kind of coming together, breaking pattern, ritual, going into a different space, bringing something back to share, So thank you
Yes.
very much.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think you brought up a very good point there, that these are ideas, these are new ways of articulating in a new cultural environment, ideas that have existed in previous cultures, that this is a revival of it. And I don't know how many of you know the work of Antero Ali. He has done some interesting writing on the Tim Leary's 8th Circuit model of intelligence, and he's a he also does an independent filmmaker, but he is director also of a experimental physical theater group around here called Paratheatrical Research, and I've been a member of that group for about 18 years now, and that's been instrumental in my liberation process and liberating, and that's always works with this ritual physical theater form of breaking physical patterns and learning to free up certain energies, learning to embody the archetypal and the shadow, and discover buried movement patterns and natural movement impulses, and that form is very much the kind of movements I see people make when they're experimenting with that. If I watch rituals in Aboriginal cultures, especially where they're playing with really letting forces possess them and ride them, I'm seeing exactly the same thing. And you see exactly the same thing in neurodivergent people who are letting their neurological creative potential out to its utmost. Glenn Gould, piano player, go on YouTube, look for videos of Glenn Gould playing piano. You will see autism at its finest and see somatic ecstasy at its finest. That way he moves has a whole lot to teach. Yes. Next, Dinky.
Thank you so much. I don't know quite what I want to ask. I just want to say a couple of things because some things are really coming together for me from this. And I just want to say I had my own diagnoses of all kinds of stuff later in my life, and what it became clear, people were giving me different diagnoses of ADD and sensory disintegration or whatever, it doesn't matter, but the bottom line for me was that my brain operated differently, and how can I work with this? And what I'm hearing from you, there was an experience when I was in my 20s that I want to share because it was really influential for me. I was living in New York, and I have a lot of sensitivity to sound. And when I was on the subway, waiting for the subway, I was on a local stop, and the express train would come by, and it would really bother me a lot. And I would put my hands over my ears to stop the sound. And then one day I had this brilliant idea to find the note that the train was riding on, and I started to scream in that note, which was so liberating, not only to be able to scream in New York and not get arrested, but also that when the train came by, I rode the energy instead of being against it. I worked with it, and then after the train went by, I was enlivened by it, and it was like, oh boy, the express train. and it was a secret that I didn't know at that point that I had any neuroatypical stuff going on, but I've looked back on that experience as what you're saying. It's like how to harmonize with the differences rather than to fight it.
Yes.
And what I'm hearing tonight, it's like, oh, that would be so fun. Once I got diagnosed, I started to kind of figure out how can I feel my brain to move in different ways.
Yes.
And so that I started to look at my behavior and see when I would get angry, how to stop before that, and how to play with it in a different way so that I could work my brain not to just be more conscious of how my brain operated. And I do cranial work, so I have that kind of sensitivity to do that with other people. And once I started doing that, it became like in training, like with that train experience, it was like, how can I harmonize with these experiences? How can I kinesthetically feel what's going on in my brain? And so like an example, I'm really hypersensitive to a lot of things in the environment chemically. And so what I do is that I try to experience the vibration of that entity to be harmonizing with it so that I won't be against it, if this makes sense.
Beautiful. That's great.
So then what I got tonight was like, oh, that would be so cool. I think it was implicit, but to me, like, how can I live in the brain of the autistic brain? Because these are, you know, we're so creative, and if we don't have to be suppressed, how to learn from each other's brains to be a more fully functioning being, and how to, you know, that the neurotypicals are missing out on, you know, it's like how
But they don't have to. They can do this stuff too.
That's right, they don't have to. But how to use this as a, I mean, I think that's what you're saying. It's like how to be able to use all this diversity, like any other diversity training, to be fully functioning as a culturally sensitive environment, and to learn from each other, and to embody these neurotypical differences, or neuroatypical differences, that we can then change our own brain chemistry and neuropathways so that we can be fuller to hold so many more possibilities of how the brain functions.
Beautiful. Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Henny had a question over there, right? Yes.
I just had to mention, make you laugh. I had no spoons left by 5 o'clock. I still have to come in, so I'm glad I came.
Oh, me too.
Found some forks on the floor and came. I just finished writing a book last year. It's in the hands of my very gifted publisher right now. It's called Teaching to the Gift. And it's a book on piano pedagogy for the different learner. Just opening up the opportunity for people to learn something in an ancient tradition, but in a different way. Because I get all those discarded students, they come to me, teach me, teach me. But talking about, you know, diversity in education is really frightening for educators, because that's impossible for them to fit into the box of the Common Core. They can't, they need a system so that they can duplicate it, and they need measurable objectives. And when you're telling them that every student needs to be taught differently, they flip out. So hopefully this is something that on a systemic level we can then move on to spreading this. And I think that one way to get this accomplished is by more autistic people speaking out and writing in a way that appeals to the majority, using scientific language, getting educated on their terms, playing their game, entering their professional degree program so that we can come out speaking their language so that they can understand how we envision a world that's a lot more diverse. So that's just one thing, but I also wanted to ask you about the cool weird shit that my brain sometimes does. 2 years ago I got my official musical savant tiara, and I was, at the time, I had passed 6 auditions, 6 different colleges on piano. I had never studied music in my life, but I memorized 3 pieces the night before from YouTube and passed auditions, and I didn't know it wasn't normal until about 3 weeks into the semester, when I found out that the keys on the piano had names. So that was after playing Bach, Chopin, Debussy. So the question here is, after I endured this whole classical training in the past 2 years, I lost the ability to hear anything and play right back. And I want to bring that back. I feel like the purity of that ability is gone. And to kind of break down that armor that you speak of, is there a way to bring that back without discarding the education?
Yes, that's a wonderful question, and that is an amazing. This is an amazing illustration of a phenomenon I think happens frequently to people in different ways. The training we receive does blot out the natural gifts. Sometimes we have to build the false self of the classically trained pianist or the classically trained dancer, and and then it's then how do we bust back out of that? But the great thing is that, the hard thing is it's terrible to lose the gift, to have it buried under the false self. But the false self is a skill set, and the wonderful thing that I've discovered is that when you can loosen the false self and let the true self back out, you don't lose the skill set that you built up with the false self. You don't lose necessarily. You become a hybrid. You can keep the training and yet not over-identify with it, not be stuck in it. But it is a challenge to get the gift back. It's hard, and it's a cautionary tale, one that I hope that you'll write about. It's a cautionary tale. Make sure you don't lose the gift. Make sure you don't get it buried under all of that training, because it's hard to liberate it, and nobody knows exactly how to do it. Nobody knows exactly how your individual brain works, how your individual self works. I promise that it's in there. I don't think you can kill a gift like that. It can only be buried. And if it can be buried, it can be excavated. So start to play. Start to experiment. Find out. I think we can talk sometime in the future, you know how to find me, but about maybe the sort of the paratheater techniques I work with and stuff, because sometimes it's about liberating. What did your body do? I'm betting that when you were just doing it purely by ear, there was a particular way you had of moving and listening, and that classical training involves a whole disciplining of the body. And so it's going to be about regaining the whole way your body worked when you were accessing the gift. And when you can find that again, I think the gift is still there. So play with it, explore, and you end up with a wider range of options than you had before, which I think is always a good goal. Any more questions?
I'm pretty loud. You said that Glenn Gould was a good example of autistic movement.
Yes.
And then you alluded that there was a certain type of dyslexic movement. Is there a celebrity or personality in the main that typifies that?
Chris Barron, the lead singer of the Spin Doctors, is actually one of my best friends in high school. Princeton High, class of '86, produced lead singers of the Spin Doctors and Blues Traveler, and me. Good graduating class. Chris, has a very distinctive moving style and a very distinctive dyslexic handwriting. Super dyslexic. You can actually see on Spin Doctors album covers, often the lyrics are handwritten by him just because his handwriting is so weird and dyslexic. If you just watch, especially when he was younger, older performances of him on stage when he was younger and moving around a lot, you can really see that style exemplified. Yeah, great question. Other question? Oh, there's a question there.
Hi, I've got a somewhat semantic question for you.
Okay.
I get the idea of self-liberation, which is really interesting. It really charms a lot what you've been talking about. But this idea of spiritual emergence, the word spiritual is so loaded with all kinds of voodoo. In our culture, I just wondered if there was any way that you could talk about the word spiritual a bit more and what it means to you and how you see that.
Well, The group that's hosting us is called Spiritual Emergence, and I intentionally chose to put self-liberation there in my title, kind of to avoid that whole spiritual word, you know, that I like the term self-liberation better than the term spiritual emergence often for that reason. Spiritual emergence, though, as the term has come to be used, the specific term spiritual emergence, often refers to what psychiatry will tend to call a psychotic break. You know, when in other words, so you get this thing that's pathologized. This person is suddenly hearing voices and hallucinating and having some complete personality change and all that. And so it's spiritual emergence is the idea. The idea is reframing this as something is emerging, something, you know, that it's not something to be pathologized, but something to be nurtured. And if it's nurtured in the right way, it doesn't have to be a catastrophe. It's a breaking apart of something, but what? A breaking apart of the false self often, and often that's just a severe shock, you know. But what does the Steely Dan song go? Any minor world that breaks apart falls together again. So, spiritual, make of it what you will. Define it for yourself. I think that the term is here to stay for a good long while. So, I would say, how do you want to use it? You know, to me, when I talk about spiritual work or spiritual emergence or the spiritual, I'm talking about neuroqueering. I'm talking about liberating the true self. I'm just talking about finding our most awesome creative potentials individually and as a community and as a species. And maybe there's something teleological going on. Maybe there's some divine guidance in there, or some higher intelligence that's either drawing us, or that we're becoming, or that's drawing us to become us, or maybe not. Maybe we're all just making it up as we go along. I don't know. You know, so it's really about, I think, what appeals to you aesthetically. And again, like we were talking about with the term addict, you know, what works for you? What works for you? I would say, you know, I meet hardcore anti-theists who just get their backs up and get really rigid angry every time they hear words like spiritual, and I don't think that's working for them. But I think that if you have a word out there that's so loaded and so ambiguous and stuff like that, make it non-ambiguous for yourself. Find a definition of it that's palatable for you and that works for you, so that instead of being a problematic word, it becomes another tool in your toolkit. How do you define it that makes it something that benefits you if you use it? You got another trick in your repertoire.
Thank you.
All right, next question. Do we have any more?
I have a question.
Oh, cool. And you have the microphone.
And I have the microphone. As long as someone wants to hand up. There's so many things that I want to respond to, so I have to limit. I have ADHD, so it's hard to do that. But a question about, I guess what's most, what I want to ask you most is, how did you make it? And my first thought is oh, we went to a somatics program, and I chose a PsyD program, which was a wrong move, and then realized I had ADHD, and it was too late. But yeah, I guess, I don't know if there's an answer for that, but I have just had this image come into my head now of what it would be like to have mentors that the student body had access to, who had been through the program and graduated, and could offer some. We have Emily Scher in the audience, who is fantastic neurodiversity coach through the Disability Center at CIIS. Awesome. So we're really lucky to have her. But yeah, how did you make it?
Well, I'm still writing my dissertation in the transformative studies program here, so I don't know that I've made it. You know, I'm still working on the dissertation proposal, and it's been a while. So how did I make it? but I'm happy. So that's good. How did I make it? I don't know. I'm still making it. It's a work in progress. It's always a work in progress. I think audacity would be the key there. Audacity is important. I looked for places where I could do what I wanted to do, and I really pushed the edges of that. And it's still an ongoing process of breaking down the false self and all of the shoulds, and I should do it this way, and everyone's expecting me to do it this way. And it's really been a whole life of doing that. It's been hard. I spent a lot of my 20s homeless, and I spent a lot of times, unemployed or working minimum wage jobs or stealing or whatever. It took me a while making it as kind of a new experience for me. And there's a time in the middle of the somatics program where I didn't think I was going to make it in my life in general, and actually doing thriving is a relatively recent experience in my life after a lot of work towards it and setting things up that way. Setting up the right niche for myself and learning to inhabit it and defend its borders without tightening myself in the process. For instance, as an Aikido teacher, persistence in my Aikido training was key, but so was at some point in my teaching career going independent so that I could do things my way, and looking for ways, how can I do things my way? How can I work with other people who will let me do things my way? Where does my way work? Again, here I am, wandering around and rambling and absolutely not doing what good public speakers are supposed to do, and saying, oh, I can get away with this, I can do this, I can do this because it's authentic. It's authentic. I knew I was going to talk about authenticity, and I said that in the beginning, remember? And I did. I am doing it. It is because it's authentic, and there's power in that. There's power in authenticity. And when you're authentic enough and you insist on doing things that are authentic and consistent with your true self, people will either utterly reject you or they will embrace it and allow it. And either way, you know where you stand. So that may mean, shifting. It may mean sometimes if you're doing grad school, it may mean going to a different program, or it may mean that you put your foot down about something and say, I want to do it this way. You find a faculty mentor, and it turns out you can do it that way. And I'm playing with that with my dissertation right now because I had all these ideas about what a dissertation should be, and I was stuck for a year. I finished my coursework, and for a year I couldn't write anything because I'd committed to a dissertation topic that was very conventionally scholarly. It was neurodiversity related and autism related, and so I thought it would be cool because it was my field of expertise and I was saying what I wanted to say, but I committed to a form that was not authentic to me. There was no way I could write a couple hundred pages in that form. My brain just wouldn't do it, and I couldn't even get started writing a dissertation proposal. And more than a year, I finally went to my dissertation chair, who was awesome. I knew. I picked people from my dissertation committee who were awesome, who I knew would allow me a lot of freedom, and I didn't use that freedom because I'm still figuring this shit out. But finally, I was like, I had this inspiration actually while doing physical theater work. I was like, no, I'm doing it all wrong. I need to write an autoethnographic dissertation where I wildly free write about my weird experiences and then analyze them using as little academic language and as little traditional academic form as possible. And I want to make the way I write the dissertation and the form of the dissertation an expression of how my brain actually works. And that means weird and spirally and nonlinear, and that's how I want to do it. And I went to my dissertation chair about it and pitched it at him, wildly ranting about it and gesticulating, much as I'm doing right now, and he loved it. He loved it. He said, yes, this is great. This, I can see by the way you're moving and shining right now, I can see, he's a somaticist himself, so he's like, I can see right now that this is more authentic for you, that this is something you'll actually write. So, find faculty you can work with who will let you do the weird shit you need to do, and then do it. And don't compromise.
Thank you.
I'll take maybe like one more question, if there is one more question, maybe two more questions, and then we'll do something else. Yes?
Hi, I've got a question about sexuality actually.
Okay.
I was watching 50 Shades of Grey yesterday.
I'm sorry.
Which is, in a way, it's kind of, it's about kind of recognizing how people can manage intimacy, and their sexuality. And for me, there seems a lot of parallels between kind of what you're saying, just like kind of being true to who you are, kind of what's driving you, how you manage to connect, etc. I know it's a big taboo, but it just, I don't know, it just it seems there's a lot of common ground. I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Common ground.
Well, just
between.
Well, for example, like people, have in the modern, well, throughout history, have trouble being authentic with their
with their sexuality,
with their instincts, how they manage to hold power, how they manage to have intimate contact with people, how they can manage to kind of love.
Right.
When it's incredibly difficult, and there's there's a whole issue of false self and true self, and so it's just kind of, for me, there seems a lot of parallels.
Yes, I see. Yes, I agree. I totally agree with you. There are what I'm talking about is very much applicable to sexuality. I think maybe it's inseparable from sexuality. For Wilhelm Reich, for instance, he was all focused on sexuality. He started out as a Freudian disciple, and they split off from each other, with much shaking of fists and shouting, as happened with Freud and most of his closest people. But Reich took with him, he got his great ideas about character armor and liberating oneself from character armor, but to him it was very much about sex. It took later somaticists, the people doing the work here at CIIS, for instance, in the somatics program, to really develop this idea of taking it beyond the sexual and into just all aspects of the creative. But I think it's very true that sexuality is very much, it's a giant way that our energy gets used. It's a giant place where our flow is either blocked behind a false self or allowed to flow freely. And so, and it's inseparable, I think, from our performance of our neurotype in general. Then I don't know that I could have neurotypical sex. I think that's ridiculous trying to do it. I clearly have sex like an autistic person, and you can't really have sex like someone of a different neurotype. You got to follow your neurological promptings. What are your, indulge your own sensory tendencies and your own movement tendencies. It would be terrible trying to have sex moving and sensing like somebody you aren't. So yeah, I think very parallel and very intertwined. Is there one more question back there? You'll be the last question.
Here comes the mic.
So my chronic hypertension has prevented me from wanting to talk this whole time, but my sweating palms are gonna get out there. Just to kind of round out the theme that the talk was going with, with the, I don't know, comparing this Western medical culture kind of model that is so hinged on like a priest class of doctors and the diagnosis that prevents like that direct connection of yourself to your body or to your experience. It's really funny, like wanting to be a psychology student in the somatics program and being a BAC graduate, hopeful somatics person. There's such a paradox in like wanting to be a practitioner so that you can tell people that they don't need a practitioner. But I just think that that idea keeps rounding through my head, and we don't need a doctor-priest class, you know, to have that direct connection. So.
Well, we don't, and at the same time, we need guides and facilitators. They're always valuable. And I think, again, authenticity, that the problem with the conventional doctor-priest class we've developed is that their experience isn't authentic. They have a lot of abstract knowledge. They have, you know, and so there's a separation. I'm a sensei by trade. That's what you call an Aikido teacher. And sensei, it literally means like born before, like member of the previous generation. In other words, what qualifies me to teach someone Aikido is that I was an Aikido student, you know, and still am, that I am training in Aikido and I just started a generation before my current students. So there's an elder thing going on, and that is authentic and part of the tradition of, you know, Aboriginal cultures that don't have that massive alienation. So I think that's what's needed. And, you know, I mean, the problem, I'm a great fan of ecstatic experience, however you label it, whether you label it religious or mystical experience, or whether it's just the potential of your own brain and body, and whatever it is, you know. I love these transformative, extraordinary experiences. A problem that arises with organized religion, I mean, there are many problems that arise with organized religion, but one of the problems is you develop a priest class that has not necessarily had these experiences. And so they are giving people spiritual advice, but are actually alienated from direct spiritual experience. So all they're doing is repeating this endlessly repeated abstract dogma and set of rules based on somebody else's spiritual experience a very long time ago. And the same thing happens with therapists, I think, as they get, you know, if I'm having wild hallucinations, I'm seeing angels bursting out of the walls, I want to talk to someone who has had that experience, not someone who has read books about what that means for me diagnostically. I want to talk to someone who had that experience and who either can tell me how to make it stop, or tell me how to live with it, or tell me how to get more pleasure out of it. Whatever it is, I want someone who's been there or is there to be helping me with it, you know. And this is, you know, I mean, they did this at Woodstock. When people were freaking out on acid, they'd get them in this tent and they'd calm them down and help them have a better trip. And then they'd be like, okay, now you stay in this tent and help the next person who comes in freaking out. And that I think is the way to do it. And so as somatic therapists, I think we have an opportunity to subvert the whole doctor-priest class thing by being there, by doing the work ourselves. So this is what I would say to anyone who wants to, conduct any kind of therapy, but especially if you're going to go into somatic therapy, do your own somatic work all the way, you know, freak out, do things that just break down the armor so much that you like hysterically laugh and sob, because sooner or later you'll get a client who does that, and you got to know what it feels like. You have to have been there and not just have an abstract knowledge of it. So I think this is a good time to stop and have refreshments and talk informally among ourselves and about, I'll be hanging out for about another 15 minutes and can happily answer questions close up and in person where I can taste you and sniff you and stuff. And I'm going to stroll over, about sort of my 9:30, I'm going to stroll over to neurotype at 1600 Folsom, and anyone who wants to join me for a meal there is welcome to do that too. But thank you all very much.